Spacecritics, J. Hillis Miller and Joseph Frank. Ever since the war, American criticism has remained relatively stagnant. This does not mean that no outstanding individual works have been produced, or that no gifted and original newcomers have appeared on the scene. It is, from a methodological point of view, that no striking innovations have taken place. The assumptions on which literary criticism has been living, in the universities and in the journals, have not been fundamentally challenged. This in itself is not necessarily distressing. It may well be that the developments that occurred earlier in the 30s were so rich and varied that it took more than 20 years to refine and exploit them to the full. Yet a certain paralysis seems to have set in, especially in comparison with recent European effervescence. New criticism has turned into the fruitful and didactically effective discipline of close reading, replacing philology and conventional literary history as a propedeutic, but unable itself to lead to larger undertakings. Marxist and psychoanalytic criticism have shown little vitality. Although their existence has been known for quite a while, the impact of writers such as Lukács, Benjamin, and more lately Adorno has hardly been felt here. Even works that appear on first reading to open up new perspectives, such as Northrop Frye's Anatomy of Criticism, turn out at closer examination to be merely a somewhat artificial synthesis of well-established earlier approaches, a combination of archetypal and formalist criticism less interesting than were, in their days, the essays of T.S. Eliot. The newcomer who tries to find stimulation and guidance in the work of his elders may well be overcome by a feeling of weariness that drives him to other shores, or, if he is timid, to an even more remote return to traditional literary history. To this somewhat gloomy picture, one should not oppose an image of brilliant liveliness and enthusiasm in Europe. That certain recent developments in France and Germany seem endowed with a kind of revolutionary freshness is due, to no small degree, to the incredible inertia that surrounds them. If one speaks of a 20-year-long stagnation in the United States, one should speak of a century-old stagnation in most European academic institutions. And if one can regret that American criticism has not been sufficiently aware of certain theoretical speculations on the continent, and has shown a somewhat provincial reticence in wanting to remain almost dogmatically empirical, this shortcoming is more than counterbalanced by the profound ignorance and distrust with which Europeans consider what is soundest and most valuable in American approaches to literature. In fact, it is not true that the main currents of European criticism have not penetrated into this country. Good phenomenological and existential criticism is being taught and written on American campuses. The suppler, highly enlightened historical methods of Curtius and Auerbach have been considerable inroads. Cassirer has curtailed the somewhat fantastic subjectivism that surrounded many American concerns with myth and symbol. Leo Spitzer's influence is felt in more erudite and rigorous attempts at stylistic analysis. But much of this goes on behind the often opaque walls that, in most universities, keep the various departments hermetically sealed off from each other, at least as far as critical methods are concerned. In an eloquent passage from his preface to European Literature in the Latin Middle Ages, Ernst Robert Curtius complained bitterly about the specialized departmentalization of our German universities, which expresses the intellectual assumptions of the 1850s and which, in 1950, seem as antiquated as the railroad system of a century ago. Things are by no means as rigid in the United States today, but the fact remains that American scholars and critics have often remained oblivious to methods carried out, sometimes very successfully, by their French or German counterparts across the whole. The same being just as true, I hasten to add, in the other direction. As a result, even the closest academic coexistence has not succeeded in breaking down the barriers that separate American and European criticism. It is therefore particularly satisfying to record the publication of two recent essays that seem to mark a new departure. Both undeniably belong to the field of English and American studies, but in one of them, Hillis Miller's The Disappearance of God, 1963, the filiation with certain contemporary European trends is overt. In the other, Joseph Frank's The Widening Gyre, 1963, the same filiation is more intuitive and, for that reason, all the more striking. This conscious or unconscious resemblance to European models is, in itself, totally unimportant. Nothing could be falser than to suggest that American critics should go to school in European criticism. Something much more fundamental is at stake. Each approach, in its own way, has worked toward an understanding of the literary process as such. In so doing, they are now both confronted with problems that have appeared as the result of the increased awareness they have brought about, to the extent that, in both cases, this awareness has brought them closer to the true center of their subject. They are bound to encounter similar questions, though at first the similarity may remain hidden by radical differences in terminology and tradition. A more active exchange of ideas, for which perhaps no real need was felt until now, will then inevitably take place. These two books are symptoms of such a tendency, and one can only hope for European equivalents to follow soon. The methodological novelty of Hillis Miller's and Joseph Frank's books is perhaps best illustrated by trying to define what, for all their differences, they have in common. The differences are clear enough. Mr. Miller's book deals with a group of writers belonging to a well-defined period of English literature and is based on an exhaustive knowledge of their entire literary production, not merely the main texts, but also such collateral material as journals, letters, etc. It succeeds in its avowed purpose of being a major contribution, not only offering integrated images of complex figures, but placing them within the relevant period. And Mr. Miller doesn't stop there. He attempts a general diagnosis of the spiritual crisis that characterizes the English 19th century and relates it to the fundamental movements of Western thought. Joseph Frank's collection of articles offers instead an almost random collection of shorter pieces on 20th century authors from Proust and Malraux to Blackmur and Jean-Pierre Bishop, rather loosely connected by some of the theoretical points made in the first essay. The methods of analysis are also very different. Miller's approach derives directly from that of his erstwhile senior colleague at Johns Hopkins, Georges Poulet. His book indicates how much of an impact this critic had during the very few years he spent in this country. To point to this influence in no way detracts from Miller's originality, for if Poulet's approach assumes considerable erudition and a total knowledge of a work as a whole, it also assumes an irrevocable subjectivity in the relationship between critic and poet, and thus postulates the singularity of criticism. One can copy Curtius or Spitzer or even Bachelard, but to copy Poulet is to betray him. Miller never does so, yet the presence of some of Poulet's frames of reference and structural devices, as well as, on the negative side, the avoidance of certain historical and formalist techniques, gives to Miller's book a very distinctive character. Although his manner never becomes mechanical or systematic in the bad sense of the term, it points to its own method with obvious and legitimate pride, and wears it, so to speak, for all to behold. As a result, the similarity in approach with European critics of the same generation, who have also been influenced by Poulet, is very apparent. Nothing in method or in quality sets aside Hillis Miller's book from those of Jean-Pierre Richard, for instance, or Jean Starobinski, or Jean Rousset, except for the irreducible originality that this way of dealing with literature demands. Joseph Frank, on the other hand, remains eclectic and varied, reminiscent at times of Ransom and Tate in a relaxed mood, frequently resorting to straightforward exposition, without even seeming to apply in practice the very interesting speculations on spatial form that are indicated in his first essay. And yet, something similar is taking place in both essays that sets them apart from other current American criticism. It is best put negatively. Neither of these studies is historical or new critical, and both, each in its own way, deal with the rejection of the concepts of form and of history that have been at the basis of much contemporary work. The great contribution of new criticism had been to retrieve the autonomy of the literary work and to preserve the delicate equilibrium of its structure from the onslaughts of crudely deterministic systems. This allowed its practitioners to acquire a flexible and subtle exegetic skill, still without equivalents in Europe. But it also had grave drawbacks. By setting up works of literature as if they were a priori given entities susceptible of being described and analyzed in themselves, it made false assumptions about the nature of poetic language. Much was gained by separating the temporal and spatial organization of literary language, as it crystallizes in rhythm and imagery, from the experience of space and time. But even more was lost by ignoring the highly problematic and intentional nature of these entities. Since they are made of invented space and invented time, they cannot possibly be described as if they were natural objects, i.e., objects whose spatial and temporal nature are given and not posited, let alone invented. The hopeless confusion that surrounds the notion of intentionality in Wimsatt and that is carried over in Frye's discussions of the problem indicate the shortcomings of the underlying ontology. The practical consequence is that new criticism was never able to rise above the essential but merely preparatory task of local exegesis, and never offered a convincing interpretation of entire works or historical periods. Seen as reactions to this, Mr. Frank and Mr. Miller's books can indeed be heralded as a renewal. They break out of the impasse of American formalism by rediscovering the constitutive and intentional nature of poetic language, and they both do so, albeit in very different ways, by growing conscious of the true nature of literary space. Instead of the frozen, static space of the new critical form, or for that matter of Northrop Frye's system of archetypes, Joseph Frank sees aesthetic space as the fundamental project of the writer who transforms random experience into the order of a spatial structure. It matters little that Mr. Frank's historical exposition of this process is highly debatable. His references to Lessing and Warringer are very sketchy intellectual history, and his way of equating spatial form with 20th century literature would demand so many qualifications as to become practically meaningless. The problem goes back at least as far as the early Renaissance. But his basic insight is nonetheless valid. A novelist like Proust, far from imitating or preserving empirical time, modulates by a system of complex reflective juxtapositions from a temporal into a spatial realm. Proust's entire novel can be understood only in terms of this aesthetic project. Proust's pure time, says Mr. Frank, obviously is not time at all. It is perception in a moment of time, that is to say, space. One should add that this space is essentially different from actual space in that it has the richness as well as the frailty of an intentional act. Mr. Frank develops this insight with great clarity in his essay, and illustrates it effectively in his study of Malraux's books on art history. But the purely literary essays that conclude the work make little use of the methodological possibilities inherent in the concept of spatial form. The fact that they make some prominent new critics look themselves like part of history, by treating them with proper distance, is the only evidence of Mr. Frank's further critical evolution. Hillis Miller, on the other hand, without going into theory, has made similar convictions an integral part of his method. This method proceeds by the organization of a complete literary work in terms of the underlying intent, though not in the narrow psychological sense that the author somehow expresses or objectifies certain private obsessions. Though individual with each writer, this intent marks all literary creation, and thus is susceptible of universal understanding. Whether the critic has the right, as Miller, J.P. Richard, and others do, to sever without further ado passages from the context in which they appear, is a vital matter, but one with which I cannot deal here. At any rate, as a result of this ordered découpage, to use a term recently suggested by Roland Barthes, we are no longer left with a chaotic succession, but with a figure, a trajectory, a network, from which emerges, if the critic is a good critic, the accurate image of the author's undertaking. Image, network, figure, trajectory. All these terms are spatial metaphors, and it should by now be clear that the universal character of the literary intent resides, for Hillis Miller, in its spatial nature, exactly in the sense defined by Mr. Frank. Hence the importance of geometrical figures, circles, spirals, triangles, gyres, in this terminology. Hence also a frequent interest in parallels with the plastic arts. What Mr. Miller offers us, in his frequently masterful condensations of complete lifeworks, is like a projection on one plane of intricate entities that exist in multiple dimensions. But such a projection is possible only because this tendency is present in and determined the original work itself. The existential project, to quote Barthes again, of the poet or novelist is not just any project, but the specifically aesthetic one of converting time into space. Hillis Miller does not explicitly speak of space. He uses instead a semi-theological vocabulary and, as his title indicates, sees Victorian poetry as a dialectic of proximity and distance, which are, of course, spatial terms, in relation to the divine. But this is clearly because, in his view, The Victorian effort to reconquer God becomes, for the Victorian writer, the aesthetic effort to reconquer space in the closed circularity of the poetic form. Failure, as in the case of Matthew Arnold, or success, as in the case of Emily Brontë, to reconquer this space, coincides with failure or success to reach God, and Hillis Miller is very careful and rigorous in not making this failure or success into an evaluative criterion. One can say that, for Miller, the artist's God is space. The entire method proceeds from there. Before taking this question a bit further, I want to stress that Hillis Miller's insight allows him to extend our understanding of these writers well beyond the point reached until now. The Disappearance of God is without doubt one of the most penetrating and original works of criticism to appear in this country for quite a while. There is much to take issue with, in detail as well as in the general considerations to which I must here confine myself, but in general conception as well as in specific contributions, this is an impressive achievement. Mr. Miller has a sly way of making his argument rebound. At the very moment that one suspects him of going astray, he turns about in his last paragraphs and forces one to reconsider one's judgment. The entire book is organized in that way. After working through an amusing De Quincey, a somewhat lengthy Browning, and a somewhat sketchy Emily Brontë, one is suddenly stirred up by an extremely convincing Arnold, to end up with truly outstanding pages on Hopkins. But when all this is said, I still must confess that I find Mr. Miller's concluding sentence and his introduction, which is in fact a summarizing conclusion and was written last, disappointing, not because of any real slackening in his thought, but because they reveal a flaw in the method. Both Mr. Frank and Mr. Miller write very disparagingly about history. By this spatial juxtaposition, says Mr. Frank, history becomes ahistorical. What has occurred may be described as the transformation of the historical imagination into myth, an imagination for which historical time does not exist. And in his introduction, Mr. Miller argues against historicism with an ardor reminiscent of Nietzsche's second Unzeitgemäße Betrachtung of the use and misuse of history for life. This aversion to history seems consistent enough. History being, by definition, temporal, it is bound to appear as the very chaos that the aesthetic consciousness is obliged to put into shape. And historicism, which implies a certain priority of temporal over spatial events, thus naturally becomes the main enemy of the literary sensibility. Is this not the point where the assumption of spatial forms begins to reveal its inadequacy, in that it dangerously oversimplifies the dialectical relationship between space and time in the work of art? What is called time here is the inauthentic, degraded, evasive temporality of everyday experience. To this is opposed the cycle of myth and nature beyond time, which can indeed be called spatial. According to Mr. Frank and Mr. Miller, the 19th and 20th century writer strives to be reunited with this kind of space, driven at times by such strong nostalgia as to call it God. Mr. Miller refers to this as the heroic attempts to recover immanence in a world of transcendence, and he can go very far in showing how and why these heroic attempts fail. What he does not see, though he comes tantalizingly close, is that Arnold certainly, and most likely Hopkins, is ahead of him in having discovered that, by presumably transcending time toward aesthetic space, the realm one reaches is no longer spatial at all. Instead, they discover time, although on an altogether different, more fundamental and, one might say with some caution, purer level, although this purity is not Proust's pure time, which is but space. Mr. Miller's flawless essay on Arnold shows very well how the spatial dialectic of proximity and distance becomes superseded, not just metaphorically, but in actual fact, by a radically different temporal dialectic, but from which Mr. Miller fails to draw the conclusions that would impair his method. The matter is even more involved and more instructive in the case of Hopkins. With admirable consistency, Hillis Miller shows us how Hopkins devised strategies of infinite refinement and delicacy to detect or create an analogy between the self, which is temporal, and a natural God, which he still experiences, probably under strong Hellenic influence, as spatial. We owe Miller's outstanding reading of Pied Beauty to such an analysis, the only example, by the way, of a poem read as a whole in the entire book. When these attempts fail, Hopkins recognizes that the failure is due to his too narrow conception of God as a natural, spatial entity, and, finding support in pre-Socratic thought as well as in a non-Thomist Christian theology, he expands his conception of the divine to include a mode of being that is no longer natural or analogically related to nature. Mr. Miller describes this very well, with a perfect awareness of the philosophical and theological background of this conversation, and with an equally sensitive ear for the changes it brings about in Hopkins' poetic language. But the critic's own language is less rigorous at this point. For spatial metaphors such as interlocking harmony of nature in Christ, or the naturalistically spatial reading of the word pitch in poem 65, at the expense of the much richer throwness, merely indicated in a footnote, contradict Hopkins' own conviction at this stage of his spiritual growth. By now, the poet no longer locates man's project in relation to being, but in his will, consciousness, or, as he calls it, arbitrium. But this kind of will no longer exists as the will toward space of Joseph Frank's Proustian artist. It has finally separated itself, perhaps with infinite pain, from that illusion. It now exists in the difficult, unresolved realm of time, where everything is always still ahead of us, at once threateningly imminent and elusively beyond our grasp. Mr. Miller rightly puts the exclamation of the dying nun in The Wreck of the Deutschland, "O Christ, Christ, come quickly," at the center of Hopkins' doctrine of grace, but he fails to stress that this is essentially a temporal outcry. Throughout his crucial last pages on Hopkins, I find Hillis Miller's distinctions between nature and God, correspondence and arbitrium, freedom and grace, insufficiently thought through. It is quite possible that these distinctions remained blurred in Hopkins himself, but it would have been Mr. Miller's task to unravel them instead of maintaining the ambivalence. His reading of Arnold would have been an excellent model. Of course, had he done so, his method would have been affected, and he could not have written the same introduction. For if poetic language is not really oriented toward space, but ultimately toward time, then its description can never be as plastically closed as Mr. Miller would have it, nor can it be so loftily disengaged from actual exegesis or history. A text that exists in time cannot be projected in a definitive and well-rounded shape. It has to be integrated into a continuous interpretation, for it is itself a fragment in the incessant interpretation of being that makes up our history. Those so-called spatial and meta-historical visions of literature are in fact still imprisoned in the fallen time from which they try to free themselves. This is all too apparent in the conventional view of literary history to which both authors remain committed. I have already mentioned Mr. Frank's rather useless excursion into 18th century aesthetics. But in Hillis Miller's book, the error is more insidious, for he seems to hold to the naive fiction of a past where being and value lie in this world, and he seems to think of Romanticism as the last period in which man set out to create through his own efforts a marvelous harmony of words which will integrate man, nature, and God. Romanticism is precisely the period during which the illusory character of spatial analogies was being revealed, often in a much more radical and consistent manner than in post-romantic symbolism and Victorian poetry. I can think of no better challenge for the critical method so competently represented by these two writers than to apply it to the main figures of the Romantic period.